I try to be less white. Now, I don't mean being white people are bad and it's bad to be white. That's certainly how people have used that to undermine the work. What I mean by that is I try to be less white in the ways in which being white is oppressive, in the ways that I have been socialized as a white person to be oblivious, to be racially ignorant, but also arrogant, to be apathetic, to be silent, to privilege another white person's feelings over racism, right? To feel superior.
Good evening and welcome to your library. I am David Leonard, president of the Boston Public Library and an occasional moderator of some of our great programs here at the library. Tonight is one of our fall signature programs in our occasional public conversation series. Now, I first encountered our guests' work as I was doing some research on the state of racial equity in public libraries and the library profession writ large. And we certainly know that parts of the library profession in certain parts of the world and certain parts of the country tend to skew particularly white. A very alive and interesting conversation in that context. Dr. DiAngelo is an associate professor of education at the University of Washington. In addition, she holds 2 honorary doctorates. She's a 2-time winner of the Students' Choice Award for Educator of the Year at the University of Washington's School of Social Work. She has numerous publications and books. In 2011, she coined the term white fragility in an academic article, which has influenced the international dialogue on race since. Her work and interviews have been featured on CBS, MSNBC, New York Times, The Guardian, BBC, NPR, PBS, and among many other forums, both in print and online. And in addition to her academic work, Dr. DiAngelo has been a consultant and educator for over 20 years on issues of racial and social justice. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Robin DiAngelo.
Thank you.
Now, to get us started, here we are, 2 white people having a conversation about racism and the state of racial equity in our society. I think it's important to acknowledge in any conversation who is in the conversation and who is not in the conversation. And so with our audience, perhaps we can broaden that. And secondly, isn't this a conversation that white people should be having more of anyway?
Yes. I want to be really clear that I don't believe I or any other white person can understand what we need to understand about racism if we are not listening to Black people, Indigenous people, and other peoples of color. And so much of what I've been saying, they've been saying for far, far longer. But we shouldn't only be listening to peoples of color. Racism is our problem, right? We are the obstacle and the barrier in large part. And while people of color have an understanding and experience that I can never have, I do have a piece of it that they don't have, right? As an insider to whiteness, as insiders, there's just an understanding that is invaluable. There's a way that we can expose that. It's harder to deny when, you share that experience. There's a little bit of that nudge, nudge, wink, wink. Come on, we know. And I'd like to think that it helps soften the soil, if you will, so that white folks can receive and bear witness to the experiences of people of color. So absolutely, we need to be having this conversation.
I'm a big believer in that our personal biography leads us in part to the work in our area of study. So would you mind sharing with us what led you to this work in particular?
I don't mind at all. I'll just try to be brief. nothing in the trajectory of my life would have me speaking publicly about race, would have me standing on stages and saying, I am white. Like most white people, I lived a segregated life. Like most white people, I was racially illiterate. I've never met a white person who doesn't have an opinion on racism. Have you? And usually pretty emotional. But that doesn't make it informed. And if in this country, if you have not devoted years of sustained study, struggle, and focus on this topic, you just simply cannot have an informed opinion on racism as a white person. So we have to start with the humility around that. And an example is that you can get a graduate degree in this country, be certified as highly educated, and have never discussed the foundation of the society, which is systemic racism. So yes, nothing prepared me for that, but there were a couple of endpoints that I had. First of all, I grew up poor and working class. And so from a very early age, I understood a particular experience of oppression. And I was very late to college. I didn't go to college until I was in my 30s. I was a non-traditional student. I graduated with a degree, had no idea what I could do with that degree. And then one day, somebody brought to my attention this position that had opened because the state of Washington, where I lived, had been sued for racial discrimination. And contrary to popular white mythology, it's very difficult to win a racial discrimination lawsuit because you have to prove intent. I'm not sure you could have come up with a more effective way to protect racial discrimination than having to prove intent, which is very difficult to do. But the state lost that. The welfare department, DSHS, Department of Social and Health Services, was sued. And as part of the settlement, the federal government mandated that every employee in the state of Washington had to receive 16 hours. I'm going to emphasize these words, mandated diversity training. And they needed trainers to do this. And so somebody tapped me on the shoulder and I thought, oh, what a great job. That just sounds so fun. I love that kind of thing. I'm totally qualified. I mean, I'm vegetarian, so I couldn't be racist. I'm nice. I'm just a classic, Seattle liberal. And so I applied.
With social work background, right?
Yeah. So I was in for the most profound learning of my entire life on every possible level. So because the first thing that happened is they sent us out in interracial teams. So I'm working side by side with people of color who are challenging me in the way that I see the world and the way I see myself in the world. And I do want to share this story. We had to go through a 5-day train the trainer. There were 40 of us that were hired, pretty much an interracial group. And we had to learn the curriculum. And the afternoon of the first day, the white people basically looked at the people of color and said, okay, this is the part where you teach us about racism. And they looked back and said, basically, oh, hell no, that's not our job. And I remember just being really put out, like, well, how are we supposed to know if you don't teach us, right? Because they have that classic consciousness, race is what they have, I'm racially innocent. And if you don't tell me about it, how would I know? And I'll never forget, in the middle of all this tension, this white woman calls out into the room, all the white racists, raise your hand. And all these white people raised their hand. And I just sat there like, oh my God. Well, I mean, I'm fairly astute, so I knew it was the party line, but I wasn't going to raise my hand. I'm not racist. And I drove home thinking I showed them I was the good one. What I showed them is that I had no idea what racism was, that I was not self-aware, that I was likely to be very defensive about any feedback to the contrary. And I look back now and I think, what a brilliant move. In 1 second, she just called that out and revealed where the room was at in their understanding. Now, today I would raise my hand, because I understand that to mean something very different than I did at that time. So then we went out in the field and it was almost 100% white. And it was, I'm trying to think of what words I can use. It was really hard. And the hostility was off the charts. We were often in 100% white rooms with white people complaining bitterly about not being able to get a job anymore because of affirmative action. And you're looking around going, where are they? That are taking your jobs. So it wasn't rational, but it was very real in the emotions. And I watched them express so much hostility when the only person of color in the room was whoever was standing by my side. I drove home with that person. I bore witness to the pain of it. And just over the years, it became so predictable. It was almost like a script. And I just got better and better at articulating how we pull that off, how we live such segregated lives and yet insist that race has no meaning. So I went on to get a PhD.
Which then ultimately leads to White Fragility in 2018. And New York Times bestseller, one of the most borrowed books from the Boston Public Library from our equity reading list post the George Floyd killing.
Yeah.
So what you just described, that this early understanding that whiteness and the fragility that goes with it, even from those early days of training, shows up in the book. So I think there's a through line completely that almost comes full circle to this.
Yeah,
work.
I actually wrote the original article in 2011. So pretty much all I've ever written from my dissertation on has been trying to make systemic racism and whiteness visible. And I wrote White Fragility in 2011, and I figured it was buried in some academic journal somewhere that nobody ever saw. And one day somebody quoted extensively from it in like a weekly paper, and it just exploded virally. And I began to get emails literally from around the world from people who said, you've named an experience I have that I didn't have language for, either as the recipient or the perpetrator of that. And so I wanted to make it more accessible and turn it into a book. I went to Beacon Press, which is a local Boston nonprofit social justice press right here. And it did debut on the New York Times bestseller list. And it was still on that list in the summer of 2020. Right. And that's important to me because sometimes people say that, I just came out of nowhere in 2020 and took advantage of that moment. And I've been doing this for a very long time.
Yeah, I was taken by the 2018 publication date, and yes, the original 2011 article date that it's based on, because this is not a new topic. I wonder, could we spend a little time on the title?
Sure.
Because it does capture what your work is about. I think we were chatting before about defining whiteness as a concept that emerges in our struggles to deal with what racism is. So, was that something that you had from day one, or did it emerge as the work starting with those training programs went from?
I mean, the phrase white fragility just came out of my mouth in a moment of frustration, like, oh, this white fragility, right? Just like, here's somebody else falling apart just because you mentioned that, being white has meaning. I mean, that's how fragile we can be, that to just say white can upset somebody. But it's not fragile in its impact. And I think that's really important. Sometimes people who don't read it see white fragility and say, oh, you think white people are weak. I think our stamina is very low, but it's a bit like broken glass. And somebody recently said it's like like a bomb is fragile, right? Because behind it is leveraged the weight of institutional power and control. And so it's dangerous. When we have that meltdown, when we get upset and defensive, often whoever caused that defensiveness, things get worse for them, not better. So I find it to be a really effective form of everyday white social control. I'm going to make it so punitive and miserable for you to call me in on this, for you to try to share your experience with me, that you more often than not will just choose not to go there. And so you stay in your place, I get to stay in mine. So it's not a benign fragility.
But because I think, most individuals, generalizations only go so far, right? But most individuals, no one wants to admit that they are themselves racist as an individual, I think. We can come back to that in a second, right?
Taking notes, I remember.
But you talked a moment ago about our society being based more on systemic racism. And I think this distinction between individual acts of racism, systemic racism, but systemic racism shouldn't be letting individuals off the hook for their role in it or their responsibility to do something about it. No. And so this is a set of nuances that I think for people starting out with this challenge is a little difficult to grapple with.
Yeah, so individuals aren't institutions or systems, but systems are made up of individuals. And systems are not going to change if the individuals within those systems are not transformed, right? And this is so foundational, and it goes back to that story I told. What I heard when the woman called out, all the white racists raise your hand, was very different than I would hear today. So like most white people, I was taught to think of racism as individual, only individual, which means you probably have it, but I don't, right? That one over there, not this one over here.
I called someone a bad name or did something I shouldn't have done, right? And then suddenly...
And even then you probably wouldn't say you were, but yes.
No.
All right, so individual, conscious, has to be conscious, it doesn't count, and intentional. Meanness across race. Right. And those three things are very important to the mainstream definition, and it beautifully protects the system of racism because it pretty much exempts everybody. I'm really clear that I have perpetrated racism across my life, and I'm also really clear that never once was it conscious or intentional. It caused harm nonetheless. And when you change your understanding of what it means, you have such a different response. And you actually don't mind being called racist in the sense that it helps you identify, all right, what am I doing that's not conscious? It's not intentional, but it's causing harm. So white nationalism is on the rise, and I don't want to minimize that. It's growing. The recruitment among young white men in particular is accelerated. They do get in through sexism, and then they grab, and pull the young men over to white nationalism and white supremacy. And so we have to take that seriously. But I'm not a white nationalist. So my racism, my forms of collusion with the system don't look like that, but they look like something. Because no one's exempt. So it's on me. This is where I get to be an individual. Right. So what does it look like in my life, in all those unique interactions and intersections? What does it look like for me? And that's actually a really empowering question. It's not awful.
And do you think it's more about individuals becoming more conscious of what we do as individuals in our lives that may have racist consequences?
I mean, it starts there. You have to become conscious, but if it ends there, it's functionally meaningless. My awareness without action to follow it up is functionally meaningless. So I also have to do different. And I really do think when you see it differently, you will be different. In situations, you will attend and notice to different things. So in your opening, you said it's always important to think about who's in the conversation and who's not. And that's a great example. When you're around the table where decisions are being made that affect the lives of those who typically are not at the table, you need to notice that. Wait a minute, who is this going to affect and how do we know? And so there's the awareness, but now the action is we're not going to make that decision until this table looks different.
Yeah, I mean, Ibram Kendi in his work starts to paint an arc that is a little different than the language you use, but ends up saying, I'm going to do a very poor, do an injustice to his work, but it's not enough to change your own life, but we have a responsibility to change the systems, and being an active anti-racist is really what's called for, at least in one of his works. So to me, I think looking at your work and being aware of this concept of white fragility or whiteness as defined over and against, or as part of the dyad with Blackness and what it means to be Black or to be a person of color, combined with an obligation to become anti-racist, gives us a narrative whereby we do need to do more than just our own work at home.
Yes.
What in your work, in your training work, illustrates when does the light bulb go on? What is it that allows people to start to change or own responsibility for this work?
Yeah, and I think it's a little bit like water dripping on a rock. So it's not just one moment and then you've got it, right? I think about it as every moment that I push against my conditioning into white superiority, the society is pushing it right back at me. And so I can never consider myself finished or having arrived. And the forces are seductive and they're strong. And so you have to constantly, and you get the insight and then it kind of fades away and then maybe it comes back. So I can't really think of a moment. I think it was just the consistency of it.
And for people that you work with, does the light bulb go off? You know, in terms of that question of all the white racists, please raise your hand. What is it about the conversion moment that would have someone say, no, I don't need to raise my hand, to, yeah, no, I really should raise my hand with that question?
One thing I am grateful for within myself and that has enabled me to stay in the work is I have messed up many times. That would be an example of, we could say that I really just showed the whole room that I was oblivious. But rather than give up, white fragility would have me go, well, then forget it. I'm not saying anything if I can't say anything right. And I think we've all heard that. And I'm not going to do this anymore. It's too hard, right? Instead, each of those moments, I'm like, okay, what did I miss? How can I do better next time? You can't use your mistakes to give up. You use your mistakes to keep going. You're not going to grow without them. You be thoughtful. It doesn't mean you just kind of tromp all over and see what happens. Be thoughtful, but you will. You also need to be real and authentic and be willing to make a mistake and to receive feedback and to change. And so I think in any room, there are people who say to me, oh my God, I just saw something I'd never seen before. There's other people where it has to sit for a while. And then maybe it gets picked up at a later date by something somebody else said. There was a foundation there. So I don't know that there's any one answer to, but I know that if it isn't sustained, it's likely not going to work. And a lot of organizations will do the one-time thing and there's no consistency. It doesn't keep going. And odds are that's not going to do it.
Could we talk a little bit about what the roots of racism might be in U.S. society in particular? We were talking a little bit about the 400 years of history upstairs, and while your work is around recognizing the role white people have to play in this whole dialogue, there are roots of racism itself that go back earlier. Do you have a narrative or a sense of how you put that together?
Well, I like to quote Ta-Nehisi Coates around this because it's been really useful for me. There is this narrative that it's just about difference and it's natural to be afraid of difference. And I'm not really sure that's true. It reminds me of, well, somebody has to be on top. Right? You ever heard that one? That's just human nature. Somebody's going to dominate. And my reaction is, well, who's most likely to say somebody has to be on top? The people on the top or the people on the bottom? The people on the bottom aren't usually going, somebody has to stand on me. Might as well be you. So for me, it's less important, is it true, is it false, is it right, is it wrong, which is so hard to sort out. But the question that's never failed me is, how does it function? What does that narrative do or not do? Does it open or close the conversation? So the difference is just natural kind of naturalizes racism, where racism is a relatively new construct. And it certainly appears across all human history that we have people have dominated one another. So we could say that's natural. And across human history, people have worked for justice. So that's just as natural. And that's the side I want to be on. So the quotes, Ta-Nehisi Coates quote that works for me is, racism is the parent, race is the child.
Okay. Say more about
you have to kind of sit with that. Yeah. So I always thought, well, you start with race, difference. People see difference, and then racism comes because they're afraid of difference. And he's saying, no, you start with racism and you get race. So you have a group of people who have resources that you want, and you have the means to exploit those resources. And then you make up a story to justify your exploitation. And so race is the story we made up to justify what we were doing.
Which I think, given an author I interviewed last week, who is looking at the history of slavery in particular, suggests that the turning point really is where Europeans, Portuguese initially and then others later, started going from enslaving other conquered individuals to formalizing chattel slavery, the actual ownership of initially Black people as an economic unit of power, and that othering, that race follows that as a way to, it becomes racialized, and then we have 400 years of terrible history that we're trying to unpack.
Yes.
So that framing that you're borrowing from Coates matches what Howard French's work was doing back in 1471 as well.
And again, an important counter to the narrative that, well, we've always had slavery, they also practice slavery. No, we've never had the kind of industry, the kind of generation after generation after generation, the systemic nature of chattel slavery.
So to move to the more recent book, Nice Racism, How Progressive White People Perpetuate Racial Harm. So we have this historical narrative we spend a little time on. This seems to take the point a little further. Nice racism. Tell us what you're after here.
Yeah, well, I'm writing to folks like me, folks who would not see themselves on the white nationalist side or anywhere near it. And I make a claim in White Fragility that I get asked about a lot. It's a very provocative claim, and Nice Racism is meant to answer it. So I say in White Fragility that I think progressive white people actually cause the most daily harm.
Okay.
And why do I say that? I have had so many people of color, Black people in particular, say to me, give me the in-your-face racist, the white nationalist. I know where they're coming from. I know how to protect myself. But the kind of racism that gets perpetuated by folks like me is so much more insidious. It leads to gaslighting. It's hard to put your hands on. And people of color aren't typically hanging out with white nationalists. They're hanging out, working side by side with folks like me. And we are the ones that send them home exhausted day after day.
Why?
Oh, there's so many parts to that. One, we're racially ignorant, but we're arrogant in our ignorance. And it would appear that we would want to protect, it's a kind of a willful ignorance, a refusal to know or see in order to protect our identities as good, moral people. So we can be very defensive. There's a study that I cite in there by Paul Gorski and forgive me for the other co-author's name, I forget. They talked to people of color who were anti-racist activists, and they cited the major source of their burnout were white anti-racist activists. Does that surprise anybody? Because we can be so sure it's not us, and so it's everybody else, it's not us. We're going to be very defensive about protecting that identity that we have and that we want you to have. We spend a lot of time doing what I call credentialing, which is all the ways that we try to establish that we're not racist, none of which is convincing if you understand racism. So classic one, I'm not racist. I had a Black roommate in college.
Okay.
I'd say, well, was he invited to your wedding? And the reason I think of weddings and I talk about weddings is that big or small, that's your circle. And I would ask the audience, how often have you been to a wedding that if it wasn't all white, it was pretty close?
Right.
And how often have you been to a funeral that if it wasn't all white, it was pretty close? Right. Because most white people go cradle to grave in racial segregation with no sense at all that anything or anyone of value has been lost. In fact, we measure the value of our space by the absence of Black people in particular. That's a very deep message that I've internalized, that you've internalized.
Can you say a little more about that last point? Because I think that's a pretty strong statement to put out there, that we measure the success of a space by the absence of Black people.
Yeah. So when I say good school, when I say bad school, when I say good neighborhood, when I say bad, sketchy neighborhood, when I say that neighborhood's coming up, that's racial discourse. We know what we're talking about. The less Black people that go to that school or that live in that neighborhood, the higher the status of the neighborhood's going to be. And the more Black people that are there, the lower the status the neighborhood is going to be. It's just, it's so internalized. And when we talk to each other that way, we're reinforcing that. And that doesn't have to be conscious.
And we don't have to go all the way to historical redlining in the financial industry or mortgage or insurance or banking to understand that this is a practice that unintentional, unconscious, perhaps.
Yeah, sometimes I do wonder.
Or maybe not.
Yeah. Another really important understanding that we need to have about systemic racism is that it's highly adaptive. It just adapts to challenges and changes. We can see that across history, but we can definitely see it during the Obama presidency. Those of us who do this kind of work, it was harder during those years because people would say, we're post-racial. We have arrived. We have a Black president. And I don't think anyone is in denial today that we are so not post-racial, that explicit white nationalism has just exploded. There's more permission. It's like what Carol Anderson argues, every inch of Black progress is met with a backlash of white rage. So it's an adaptive system. Now that's a strong example, but neighborhoods, we steer each other away, right? So we don't need those redlining covenants. We do it in a more naturalized.
And to your point about, progress and backlash, you can do that narrative from the 13th and 14th Amendments through the Civil Rights Act, Voting Rights Act in the 60s, through to your example of the Obama presidency and what has followed. So I actually do want to take up one of the questions that we got at registration, which relates to this very point, is has anything changed for the better between the two books, or between 2011 and where we are now?
Something changed for the better in terms of society?
Yeah.
So what you're seeing, you saw the summer of 2020 when, it breaks my heart that it took the videotaping of the murder of George Floyd, that it was so brutal and so egregious that it couldn't be denied, right? That you really, up until then, a lot of white people said, well, he must have done something. But that video was so explicit and vivid. And so you saw this huge revitalization of interest in anti-racism, right? It was everywhere. And those of us who do this work, we were getting hundreds of calls every day. You've got to come, and you've got to come now, and you've got to talk about this. And now it's not in front of us on the news. And a lot of that apathy has come back in. Right?
So it didn't sustain that appetite for change.
I don't think it did. No, I don't think that it did. Now, I do see a few things. I see much more representation in ads, in movies. Sometimes with movies, it's like, okay, they put one Black person in that role, and that's better than nothing, but it's fairly token, but you see it. I've seen more people of color being asked to speak and do the work. That's a change. So, it's a push and pull.
The other part of the title here is how progressive white people. So that's the progressive part I'd like to spend a little time on, because if you're not bringing about real change, then how progressive are you really?
Good point.
And so what is it about this armchair progressiveness that is contributing to the problem rather than even moving the needle a little bit?
Yeah, I mean, in some ways, white progressives are my people. I live in Seattle. Okay, we're 3 hours.
Boston,
we're 3 hours from Portland, Oregon, right? So, and it's just so much of what I learned about how racism manifests on a daily way came from the community that I live in, from the people I'm around. It's I don't know that I mean it literally, like true. If they were truly progressive, it would be different. But I didn't want to use the word liberal. It's just white people who see themselves on this side of the struggle. But anyone who exempts themselves is not progressive and doesn't understand systemic racism. None of us are exempt. It's not going to end in our lifetimes, unfortunately.
There's another part of this that I want to draw attention to, and by the way, get the book, read the book. It's an incredible analysis of some of the challenges to where people think progress is, but in fact maybe is not. And this is the spiritual versus religious dimension, because I think religion is very much a part of our lives. Spirituality is very much a part of your lives, whatever particular thing you believe, and it's not necessarily always additive to progress. Christianity is a religion based on love.
We'll just let that sit.
And please fill in the rest of the sentence, because it's much more complex than that.
The title of the chapter is Spiritual, Not Religious, because that's the classic kind of white liberal that I'm trying to call in or talk to, where, they're going to eschew organized religion, but they see themselves as spiritual. And the ways that it can manifest around protecting racism is they can tell people of color that they just need to think positive. Why are you bringing this energy onto yourself? It can be really gaslighting to use spirituality as the answer, that if you just got closer to whatever that means to you, you would do better. And I don't know if I have the cartoon in there, but there's a New Yorker cartoon that I love that just nails this. So it's got two ducks floating, and one of them looks really miserable. And the other one says, maybe you should ask yourself why you're inviting all this duck hunting into your life right now. And it just like that's what I wanted to get at. And going down to South America and taking ayahuasca, with no understanding of the impact you have there, with no relationship to Indigenous peoples here. There are certain aspects, putting Buddhism on a pedestal, right? Buddhism is actually a really patriarchal religion, but it's very sacred to a lot of white liberals.
Well, I mean, I think history is littered with examples of religion being used to justify various forms of oppression and structure. So that I'm glad to see that unpacked or referenced in the work as well. You did mention that you often get asked about a particular quote in the first book, and I'd like to give you an opportunity to talk a little bit about that. It's like, trying to be less white.
Yes.
Could you tell us what you mean by that?
Yeah. So, and let me just say, I try to be less white. Now, I don't mean being white. White people are bad, and it's bad to be white. That's certainly how people have used that to undermine the work. What I mean by that is I try to be less white in the ways in which being white is oppressive, in the ways that I have been socialized as a white person to be oblivious, to be racially ignorant, but also arrogant, to be apathetic, to be silent, to privilege another white person's feelings over racism, right? To feel superior. And I'm just going to say this. Nobody grows up in this country not knowing it's better to be white. Not that white people are better, but it's better to be white. And research shows that as early as 3 to 4 children, all children get that message. They understand. Watch Frozen with a racial lens. Right? Look at the images. Watch the little girls of color with the backpacks, with the frozen images. Right? I could go on. Look at the Sistine Chapel, God creating man. Right? Now the impact of that message is very different depending on whether you are or are not white. But I don't think anyone could miss the message. The way you respond to it will vary. You can resist it or not resist it, but you can't be exempt from it. And that's what I'm trying to get white people to grapple with. That's a piece of it too. Internalized superiority is a piece of this work.
And you mentioned sex and gender earlier in the brief conversation there about the rise of white nationalism. So other areas of difference or othering become parallel, I think, to this work. So not only is there a narrative about racism that works here, there's a narrative about gender differences and other identities too.
Yes. So white women, I'm a cisgender woman, my pronouns are she, her. We have a really powerful way into this through sexism and patriarchy and our experiences of it. But all too often, unfortunately, white women use that as a way out, as a kind of, we're all women and we're all oppressed, and I couldn't have privilege because I experienced sexism. And you can certainly experience sexism and also perpetrate somebody else's oppression. And so we can't use it in that way. And for me, also, I mentioned earlier that I grew up poor. And from a very early age, I had a very deep sense of shame. I can share many experiences in which I felt humiliated around being dirty, having my hand held up in a classroom as an example of poor hygiene to the whole class, people whispering, shh, they're poor. So, very acute awareness of it. And I also always knew I was white in that, and I knew that it was better to be white, right? So I got that lesson too. And I tell this story in the book where, I would see food left out somewhere and we were pretty chronically hungry. We had periods of homelessness in my childhood, and I would reach for this food and I'd be admonished, don't touch that. You don't know who touched it. Could have been a colored person, which was the language at that time, which meant a Black person. And it was really clear to me that if a colored person touched it, it would be dirty. And yet we were literally dirty. But in those moments when we projected our shame onto Black people, which is what we were doing, right? I wasn't poor anymore, I was white. Those moments realigned me with the dominant white culture that my poverty separated me from. And so I think white people need Black people. There is no superior without inferior. And by the way, any white person who tries to say, I don't have racial privilege because I grew up poor, send them to me. I don't know how you can look anyone in the eye and say to be poor and Black and poor and white is the same thing. I wasn't also struggling with racism.
Can that be a source of empathy then? I mean,
ideally, yes. Empathy, not that it's the same, but that I have a way to connect. And actually, the moment when I realized, so I'm late to academia and I have imposter syndrome, always sat there feeling a day late and $1 short. And I was just sure they were all smarter than I was. And of course, I used to think that that's how it worked, that smart people went to college. And then I got there, it's like, oh, okay, that's not what, that's not how this works. This is not the cream of the crop that wrote, no. And then I began to teach college, and I'm like, this is definitely not how this works. But I would be in a meeting, right? A faculty meeting, and these people probably went to boarding school and they went to Ivy League, and they've been groomed. Their brains have been groomed their whole life. And I often wonder, oh, if only my brain had been groomed my whole life. Well,
access and privilege going on
yes.
there, right?
So I'd be in these meetings. This is what I do. I did anti-racist work before I ever went to college. So I would see dynamics happening in these discussions. Maybe it was a hiring situation. And I would want to say something like, hey, I'm seeing racism in the way we're talking about these candidates. But I would feel inferior. I feel like, what if they cite some research I haven't read, right? I don't think I'm smart enough to challenge it. And so it wasn't superiority that was keeping me quiet. It was truly inferiority. But then when I stepped out of myself and I said, so how's that functioning? How is your silence functioning in this room, regardless of what's driving it? You are upholding racism. And you know what? You're going to get ahead for doing that. And you're going to be seen as a team player. And that's just not okay. And you know what? It's a lie that I'm not as smart as these people just because of my background. And so when I speak up, I'm simultaneously using my position, but I'm also challenging my internalized inferiority and the lie of that. So for me, to center race is actually the most powerful way to address everything. A lot of white people who experience oppression want to center their oppression. And I would say, okay, you can do that, but you have to address how has being white shaped how you experience that oppression, because it's different.
And then to complete the narrative, one would hope that because you have that power or privilege, that we have a greater response. Those of us who are white have a greater, and are in positions of power, have a greater responsibility to make change.
It's not without risk, but the risks are not the same. Yeah, definitely.
I think we'd like to take some questions. And we have a number of questions that were submitted at registration. So I'm sure we have a couple of people either online or in the audience who submitted these. So I will pose them to you, Robin, and we'll see where we go. And there's a couple of looking forward to this discussion. Thank you. Loved the first book. Gave several away to friends who were also changed by it. So thank you. This question is, how do I get white leadership, presumably at their organization, how do I get white leadership to attend my race and the workplace monthly forums? So this person didn't identify themselves, so I don't know what their own personal story or narrative or identity is, I can guess. But basically, how do we engage with other white people to participate in this?
Yeah, I mean, these are challenging questions, and I think it does speak to the apathy. If you are not, if the leadership is not attending that, then whatever you have on your mission statement, whatever your anti-racism statement is, you better take it off. Because you can't have a statement like that and not actually be doing the work and showing up. So a couple different strategies they could use. The leadership needs to see that it's valuable to them, that there's something in it for them. And whatever way you can approach that. I mean, I often say in 2022, if you cannot engage in these issues with some nuance and some complexity, one, you're really not qualified to lead. And it's going to come in a moment where that's going to show, and you don't want that. Right. So, I mean, if you have to go that way, take that approach. Another one is to find maybe that one person in the leadership team that is open and ask them to kind of.
And I think it's also, you don't have to have the language perfect. You don't have to have the plan perfect, but you've got to be moving forward. And as we all make mistakes, I know I've made mistakes. You pick yourself up, you apologize if you need to apologize, and you keep going. This next question says, my school has a new group called the Racial Equity Team. As a white person, how can I serve on this team in an anti-racist way?
I'm going to assume that it's a mixed team. And so the first thing that comes to me is to ask the folks of color how they can serve. What do they need? What do they want? The more you do your own work, the more you're aware of your own whiteness and how it informs what you see, what you don't see, how you respond, the more sensitive you'll be to the dynamics at play. You always want to be paying attention and asking yourself, what is the most strategic way for me to engage in this moment? And it's really hard to get that right by everybody, but that is the question you should be asking. So is this a time where I should hold back and just listen? Is this a time where I should come forward and show myself? That's what you want to be grappling with. Any default engagement, in other words, I'm an introvert, I never speak in groups, so I don't speak in this group either. That's not a strategic engagement. That's default. You are defaulting to your most comfortable way. And I can tell you that if it's around race, your most comfortable way will be problematic.
Right. And I think it's also about knowing some groups are defined as affinity groups for people of color only.
Yes.
Others are defined for people of color and allies. And then there are some other conversations, perhaps like we're doing tonight, where there's a piece of this work that has to be done by white people.
Yes.
And asking and knowing and identifying is a crucial step. One, I forget where the section is in here, where it talks about, assuming, exactly that your opinion as a white person is welcome in every single circumstance, and it may or may not be, right? So ask.
Yeah.
This next question, what can I do as a Black woman in expressing my pain? It feels like I'm making people feel uncomfortable.
And that's one of those questions that I find heartbreaking, because it's really on us as white people to get ourselves into a condition in which she doesn't have to worry about how she's making us feel in order to express her pain. I mean, unfortunately, the society we live in is set up in a way that she does have to do that in order to be safe. And so I would ask those of us who are white to get to work to transform ourselves so that we can bear witness to her pain, that we can hear, we can affirm and validate, we can ask her what she needs, and she doesn't have to attend to our feelings, right? And that our feelings are actually grace and openness and compassion rather than defensiveness or apathy.
A lot more in this context, I would assume, that we don't know from the question, but asking is always a good place to start.
I mean, as a white person, to ask, what
do you need?
Yes.
Or what can I do?
What can I do can be a hard one. I just want to say that doesn't mean don't ask it. Right. It's just that sometimes the person who's in pain doesn't know what they want or what they need. So you want to ask that in a kind of an open way, as opposed to, I need you to give me the answer. Right. In your pain right now, give me the answer.
Right. Right. Another version of the same question, I think, but it stands alone. What can people of African descent do to better educate white allies, specifically about living while Black?
Well, there are many, many ways and forms in which Black people, people of African descent have shared their experiences. They write, they speak, they do poetry, they do performances, they share in relationships. I often think that if we have a truly integrated life, if we have authentic cross-racial relationships, if we have built trust, they don't have to tell us. Just being in relationship, we will see if we're paying attention, right? It doesn't have to be this, like, I'm going to sit you down and give you this lesson. But I also think it's an empowering choice for people of African descent, in this case, to choose not to share their tender hurts or experiences with us, and that isn't That doesn't mean they've somehow given up or sold out, but they're just like, you know, the expression throwing your pearls. You know, it's okay to say, I don't want to throw my pearls. They got crushed the last time I did it. I don't want them to get crushed. And I'm not giving you that. That's a gift.
Right. And it depends on the space and who's there and what support is needed. Agreed. I want to go back to the poverty analysis that you gave us from your own personal life, as well as in the work here, because there is also a narrative that one of the ways out of the racial injustice is, well, we just need more economic equality and all of the programs to bring that about, which I fully support. I think ultimately one of the tests of being successful will be, you know, where earnings are more equitable, where wealth is more equitable. But I'm not sure that alone, like solving poverty alone, is not a solution for racism per se.
Yeah. What I worry about when class comes up, basically capitalism, right? I mean, capitalism depends on poverty. I mean, you can't have a capitalist system without having an incredible hierarchy. And race is a really key piece, and they are deeply connected, but they're also separate, if that makes sense. And so what happens sometimes is, this is what I want to speak to here. It didn't just happen, but I want to speak to what I call channel changing. Right, where we're trying to talk about racism, and then it moves over to the real oppression is classism, and then that takes race off the table. So if we can talk about how classism intersects with racism, but we've got to keep race on the table. And there's such a strong pull for those of us who are white to get racism off the table. So it isn't that we shouldn't be or don't need to be talking about economic inequality, but if we're not centering race in that conversation, we're probably conveniently taking it off the table. It's less comfortable. I would say it's the least comfortable. Classism's so vague and capitalism's so big. They're like, yeah, let's just do that.
Which is another form of being nice about it and not actually addressing the challenge. There's a third book that I have here. You have more than three, but I wanted to spend a moment before we close this part of our evening together, talking about why did you write this book and who is it for in contradistinction to the other two. This is called The Facilitator's Guide for White Affinity Groups: Strategies for Leading White People in an Anti-Racist Practice. I'm not going to assume it's self-explanatory.
Okay, so please, thank you.
Please tell us about this book.
Like to talk about it. The ultimate goal, of course, is to bridge racial divides. But as a white person, white people generally are not in good shape to do that. And so what often happens is workplaces do this all the time. Community groups throw everyone in the room and say, talk about race. And then white people are stepping all over the feet, metaphorically, of people of color. It's often literally the words people of color have used with me is, those are traumatic experiences. You're putting me in a room with white people who don't even know what it means to be white, who've never thought deeply about their own position. And then, you're asking us to have a conversation that has any kind of meaning or is constructive in any way. So some of this we really need to do separately. It's sensitive work. Talking about internalized superiority, that's something we probably don't need to be doing in front of people of color, right? Struggling with defensiveness and hurt, and I just don't get this, right? I think people of color want us to be struggling with that. They just don't want to have to bear witness to it. And it also frees us up. It's like I'm not having to worry about the impact of what I say, so I can be more open and more relaxed. And people of color have really sensitive conversations to have that they don't want to be having in front of white people. Anti-Blackness cuts across all groups. And that's a very sensitive conversation for all people of color to be having. What does anti-Blackness look like in our group? Right? How is the darker one's skin, the more compounded the oppression? What does that look like among us, right? What about the messages of inferiority? How have I coped with those messages? Those are conversations that, one, aren't my business. and really shouldn't be done in front of me. So we really do have to have a process. It's just one tool of many where we separate and do our own work. And it's a very common practice in anti-racist circles, sometimes called caucusing, affinity groups, white awareness groups. But there's very little on how to do them. You're going to come up against all the white patterns you can even imagine in a group like that. And so I've been facilitating them for many, many years. Another person who also facilitates, we just wrote this handbook. It's kind of got the theory, the practice, how do you set it up? What are the basic skills you need? When should you not do it? And then what are the patterns you're going to encounter? What do they look like? How do they function? And what are some strategies you can interrupt them? And it's got links to curriculum. So I'm excited about it because there's nothing like that out there. And then organizations can build capacity within house. Right? They can train their own facilitators. And actually, I'm going to be doing a train the trainer on this book. So just go to my website.
Well, I think, given that you've introduced this concept of whiteness as a contribution to helping understand how we deal with our own racism and systemic racism, having also now a guidebook for how to do some of this work in practice is an amazing addition to the field. So we are right at the 1 hour mark. Wow. So we were able to take some questions that we got in advance, and I'd just like our audience here in person, and maybe if our online audience wants to join us as well, just join me in thanking Dr. DiAngelo for her time with us this evening.
Thank you.